A narrow waterway, just 21 miles wide, carries roughly 1/5 of the world's oil supply every day. What happens if that artery suddenly becomes a battlefield? In the second week of a rapidly expanding conflict involving the United States, Israel, and Iran, shipping routes through the Strait of Hormuz are under threat, oil prices have surged toward $100 a barrel, and military casualties are mounting across the region. The real question now is whether this confrontation remains a contained regional war or becomes a shock that reshapes global energy markets and military alliances. If the crisis deepens, the consequences stretch far beyond the Middle East. The Strait of Hormuz is the single most critical choke point in global energy logistics. Roughly 20% of the world's daily oil consumption moves through this narrow passage, linking the Persian Gulf to the Arabian Sea. Any sustained disruption forces immediate reactions in financial markets, shipping insurance, and national energy strategies. A prolonged closure could trigger supply shortages, push crude prices sharply higher, and strain already fragile global economic stability. The latest escalation comes amid a conflict that began on February 28th, when the United States and Israel launched coordinated military operations targeting Iranian infrastructure and missile capabilities. The campaign quickly expanded into a regional confrontation involving drone strikes, ballistic missile exchanges, and attacks on maritime assets. Within 2 weeks, the death toll among civilians has exceeded 2,000 people, the majority inside Iran, while hundreds more have been killed across neighboring states, including Lebanon. The conflict has already disrupted daily life for millions and forced governments across the region to prepare for further escalation. Energy markets reacted immediately. Benchmark Brent crude climbed close to $100 per barrel, representing an increase of nearly 40% compared with prices before the conflict began. Financial markets followed the same trajectory of uncertainty. Major stock indices in the United States experienced their largest 3-day percentage decline in a month, while markets across Asia and Europe showed similar volatility. For governments dependent on imported energy, even temporary supply disruptions through Hormuz translate into serious economic pressure. Against this backdrop, European powers are exploring their own contingency strategies. Reports indicate that France and Italy have opened discussions with Iran aimed at securing guarantees that their commercial vessels will be allowed to transit the Strait of Hormuz safely. Such diplomatic outreach reflects the growing concern among shipping nations that military escalation could disrupt maritime trade. Although details of these discussions remain limited, the fact that negotiations are occurring illustrates how quickly the crisis has begun reshaping diplomatic channels around maritime security. Meanwhile, the United States has dramatically increased its military activity across the region. Officials in Washington signaled that air operations over Iran would intensify, describing the coming wave of strikes as potentially the heaviest bombardment since the campaign began. American forces have deployed large numbers of aircraft to bases across the Middle East, relying heavily on aerial refueling to sustain long-range missions. This operational tempo carries its own risks, highlighted by a recent incident involving a U.S. Air Force KC-135 Stratotanker. The refueling aircraft crashed in western Iraq during a mid-air operation involving another tanker. All 6 service members aboard were killed. Investigators confirmed that the loss was not caused by hostile fire or friendly engagement, but the incident underscores the complexity of sustaining continuous aerial operations. The KC-135 platform, originally built during the Cold War and introduced in the late 1950s, remains a critical component of U.S. global reach. Without aerial refueling, fighter jets and bombers cannot maintain extended missions over distant theaters. This accident brings the number of U.S. personnel killed since the start of the conflict to at least 13. Additional casualties have been reported among troops injured during regional attacks linked to Iran-aligned groups. For military planners, these losses illustrate the human cost of maintaining large-scale deployments across multiple operational zones simultaneously. Iran has responded to the campaign with a combination of missile launches, drone attacks, and maritime pressure. Revolutionary Guard commanders have indicated that oil shipments from Gulf states could face obstruction if strikes against Iranian territory continue. Several vessels near the Strait of Hormuz have already reported attacks or attempted harassment, while 2 tankers were set ablaze earlier in the Iraqi port of Basra after suspected strikes by explosive-laden boats. These incidents have intensified concerns within the global shipping industry. The conflict has also produced competing narratives about battlefield developments. Iranian sources recently claimed that missiles and drones targeted a U.S. aircraft carrier operating in regional waters, alleging serious damage to the vessel. American military officials rejected that claim and stated that the carrier remained fully operational. Such contradictory accounts reflect the information battles that accompany modern warfare, where psychological messaging often runs parallel to military action. Regional tensions have spread beyond Iran's borders. Turkish defense authorities reported intercepting a ballistic missile that entered their airspace from Iranian territory, marking the 3rd such interception in just over a week. Israel has continued striking targets across Iran, reporting more than 200 air attacks in a single day against missile launch sites, air defense networks, and weapons production facilities. At the same time, Iranian forces launched additional missile barrages toward Israeli territory, injuring dozens of civilians primarily through debris from interceptions. Another flashpoint has emerged in Tehran itself, where an explosion occurred near a large pro-government rally marking support for the Palestinian cause. State media reported at least 1 death in the blast. Security forces across the capital have increased their presence as residents cope with ongoing air raids and the broader uncertainty created by the conflict. Despite calls from external actors encouraging internal political change, there has been little evidence of organized unrest while the country remains under direct attack. 2 possible futures now stand before policymakers. In the first scenario, military operations escalate further and shipping through the Strait of Hormuz becomes severely restricted. Under those conditions, insurance premiums for tankers would skyrocket, energy supply chains would tighten, and governments might deploy naval escorts to maintain maritime flow. Such a step could internationalize the conflict even further by drawing additional countries into the security framework protecting the strait. The second scenario involves gradual de-escalation, driven by diplomatic engagement and economic pressure. If negotiations succeed in restoring safe transit for commercial shipping, oil markets could stabilize, and regional actors might step back from direct confrontation. Even in that outcome, however, the episode would leave lasting scars on global energy security and on the strategic calculations of every state reliant on Middle Eastern supply routes. What remains clear is that the Strait of Hormuz has once again become a focal point where military power, energy economics, and international diplomacy intersect. The coming weeks will reveal whether the world is witnessing a temporary crisis or the beginning of a deeper transformation in how global powers manage conflict in one of the planet's most strategically sensitive regions.